Everyone. I'm Tony Ferris, a graduate printmaking student here at Edinburgh University. After growing up in Long Island, I earned a BS from SUNY Oneonta, and I'm currently a graduate assistant for the Bruce Gallery. As a part of my work, I'm helping to organize an online event every Wednesday. We call them webinars. Before I introduce tonight's presenter, let me share the 3 pieces of housekeeping. First, we're recording this event and will eventually post the link at brucegallery.info. Second, we want to hear from you, so post your questions and comments in the chat, and I'll share them as time permits. Third, we are ending by 6:30 p.m. tonight. However, we'll be back next week, same time, same link, for a presentation by the March, well, it's actually going to be something else. We're not going to have an artist in residence next week. It's going to be something again with Wellman on a panel discussing things that some of the pieces that we have in the collection. But now let me introduce Rachel Liebskin. Rachel is currently an artist in residence at the ERIE Arts and Culture Center. Rachel uses a range of medium to express her views of art. She believes artists should not be limited by one medium because of the restrictions that lie within. Currently, she has been working with performance art, and today we'll be giving her discussion on Nothing Means Anything and Everything Means Something. And now welcome Rachel Liebskin.
Thank you, Tony. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I am very pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk about my performance practice, which is really just one part of a bigger practice of mine that involves, as Tony said, many media. I'm not limited to a single or even a couple of media, but I spoke to Lisa a little bit about the people you've had speaking here, and she mentioned that you hadn't had anyone to really talk about performance as an active studio practice. So I wanted to come talk to you guys a little bit about that and about really what I think is, it's just such a really wonderful, enriching, and important part of my practice as an artist. I'm going to try to talk only for 40 minutes. I'm going to present to you guys 3 performances that I've done and a little bit about how I do them and what they entail, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for questions. And I encourage you to ask whatever you want to ask. I'm pretty easygoing, and I am interested in hearing your thoughts and any questions, even if it's not related to my performance. Please ask away. So before I start sharing my screen, I guess I should say I titled this talk, Nothing Means Anything and Everything Means Something, and because I think we live in a really interesting time in terms of meaning. And as artists, I personally believe, what differentiates an artist just from a craftsman or an artisan is that artists have something to say. And, what you can say doesn't have to mean that you're saying something hyper intellectual or hyper or deep or profound, but what you're saying is being picked up whether you want it to be or not in your work, because things that are visual, things that are audio, things that you can feel and that you experience with your senses, they have meaning. And that meaning is not always so controllable by you as an artist, but it's important to know that, people experience things all the time in the world, and especially in the world we live in, which is a hyper visual media world. And it's important to take agency and ownership, I think. And it's one of the most wonderful parts of being an artist, is to decide actively, well, what do I want to say? And who am I talking to? And who am I? And, what do I think about the world? And I think, one of the things that's so strange about living in 2021 is that it's also a time where meaning has been voided. We live in a time where there's also meaninglessness everywhere. When you scroll on your phone and you look at thousands of images a day, what are you really taking away from? Do they really mean anything? Do we really soak up things in the same way in our culture that's so saturated with information? And at the same time, to counterbalance that total meaninglessness of the time we live in, we also live in a time where our culture is, for better or for worse, a very, very, very sensitive, hyper aware culture where people will take meaning and they might get offended, they might be inspired, they might be indifferent, God forbid, but it's always walking this strange line for me as an artist of nothing means everything that I do, and do people really care? Are they really aware of the work I'm making? And at the same time, everything means something, and I have to be aware of what I'm putting out there in the world. So that's my preface. I am going to share my screen now so we can do. Okay, here we are. So my practice involves painting, sculpture, drawings, printmaking, things that you make in a studio is kind of how I like to begin to describe my practice. I make stuff in the studio, both in a traditional way of making that involves traditional art making, but also in a kind of crazy way where I collect and curate trash and objects and books. And that's the first primary level of my practice. The secondary level of my practice is that I like to make installations because I like my work to be experienced with sound and video and feeling and in space. So I'll sometimes take objects out of that studio practice, I'll put them into an immersive installation. And then the third level of my practice is that I like to go perform in those settings that are installations of my making. As a kid, I danced and I sang opera till I was 18 pretty seriously. I put it all away to go become a studio artist. And it really wasn't until a few years out of college that I even considered making performance art. It was not something that I thought about in my education and university. It was not something that I ever dreamt of. But, I believe that we all have these things in our childhood that where we learn how to cultivate passion. And whether that's sports, whether that's political engagement, whether that's writing, whatever it is that you really, as a kid, really connect to. For me, it was performing music. I believe that as an artist is a really big well. And it wasn't until later in my 20s that I learned to kind of harvest this cultivated passion that I had for performing and really for putting on a show. But it wasn't really a traditional show. And I first got involved in the performing arts professionally because I needed to make money, as we all do as artists. And I realized I could make money making set design for theater and musicians and just lots of different stuff. So I started doing video installations for bands and musicians and making kind of the cheapest, craziest installations I could do for small scale black box theaters. And this was really how I got into reconnecting to the performance space, which, I believe is a really sacred, really primitive space. And, I was saying to Tony earlier when we were talking a little bit before the talk, like one of the things that I find fascinating about performance is that you tell people that they're coming to a performance. Doesn't matter if you're in a theater, doesn't matter if there's a stage, doesn't matter if they're on the street. People, all of us, we identify either as performer or as audience. And those roles are so ingrained in us that that was where when I kind of started spending more time around the stage and around people who were performing, I realized, wow, this is such a powerful thing. People show up to performances and they are ready to be audience members. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about performance, certain artists that made work that inspired me. And I realized there were artists out there who weren't just performance artists, but they were artists that I loved. So this is a picture of a performance by Yves Klein, who's one of the most famous artists from the 1960s, who painted women's bodies in his Yves Klein blue and then dragged their bodies along canvases. Obviously problematic in today's age, but important work. The work of Ana Mendieta, who's a famous 1970s feminist performance artist, was very inspiring. Carolee Schneemann, who's an incredible 1970s feminist artist, literally wrote a feminist manifesto that she pulled out of her genitals and read to the audience. Blew my mind when I learned about her. Bruce Nauman walking in a straight line in his studio in the 1970s. I mean, these are just works. Martha Rosler's Semiotics of the Kitchen. These were works of artists who I didn't know as performance artists. I just knew them as people I'd learned about in my textbooks and culturally I'd seen in museums, and kind of realizing that they had a performance practice opened my eyes to the possibilities. This famous work by Marina Abramović at MoMA, gosh, I guess it's like 8 years ago now, where she just sat and stared at people in a museum. Her work, if you're interested in performance and interested in how to put it into your practice, Marina Abramović is one of the most important living performance artists today. Then I was also became interested in like artists who made work that existed performatively without performance itself. So this is a work by Tracy Emin called My Bed, where she just literally took her bed out of her house and put it into the studio, into a gallery. And obviously she's not performing anything, but there's an active performance happening in this work. And then to me, the person who sort of started it all, which is Marcel Duchamp with his urinal. To me, anyways, that's sort of my overview of artists who are in my mind, and when I started my performance practice, who I thought a lot about. So I started performing totally by fluke. I was invited by a festival in Italy, a very prestigious festival. I have no idea why they invited me. No idea. I had no qualifications, but they invited me to come perform at this 2-week-long festival called the Festival of Spoleto in Umbria in Italy. It's a performance, art, theater, and opera festival. And I thought they knew I wasn't a performer. So I was like, okay, this is this crazy performative installation I want to make about a suitcase and many suitcases and suitcases being unpacked. And I'm going to make this installation, and this is my budget, and I'm not going to have to perform. And I got there, and it was an incredible 15th century abbey on a hilltop, and the whole place had been taken over by different performances. And I suddenly realized, like, oh God, they're ticketing this. It's 4 performances a day. It's 2 weeks straight. All these other esteemed performers are here. Like, I have to actually do something. I can't just make an installation and put my sound on and leave the room. So it was a crash course by fluke. And I find that in my work, and for a lot of artists, the crash course is really what teaches you how to do, teaches you what you're good at. And it was an amazing experience. So this piece is called The Traveling Bag. And it's a piece that I've now done, gosh, in 7 or 8 or 9 venues. And it's always different. It's never the same performance, and it's a silent performance. And it's a piece that in which I pack and unpack as many bags as I can get my hands on. Sometimes the bags are filled with things that I've brought out of my studio. Sometimes they're filled with trash. Often they have objects that to me have a lot of meaning, like maps, like books. Sometimes they have things that are strange, like glassware, things that make people stressed out, being, rustling about in the suitcase. And in performing this piece so many times, I mean, I think I did it 60 times. It's a 15-minute long performance. For the first time, I realized, like, wow, all these people coming in to see this work, they are all connecting to different parts of this performance. Some people see the suitcases and they are thinking about travel and transientness around the globe. Some people are connecting it to it from a perspective of exile and a perspective of immigration and emigration. Some people are seeing the suitcases and they're looking very literally at the metaphor of emotional baggage. Some people are focusing on what I'm doing. And as the performance went on and on, here, this is my little text just to show you guys. I'll go back to that in a minute. As the performance went on and on, I started to do more, and I started to get more into it. And definitely it's the piece that I've done the most, having now done it in so many places. I've written and rewritten this text. I find for every performance piece that I do, I try to write a text, because performance is not my main thing. As like I said, I'm making all this other stuff that I'm selling and showing at galleries. I'm only doing really one big performance a year. So I try to put my thoughts about my performances and what I'm trying to do into something that's succinct, but something that can exist as a document that really serves as a blueprint, or what in theater they would call like a libretto for a piece like this. Because there's no, this piece just involves any suitcases I can get my hands on, and whatever's inside the suitcases changes, and the installation changes as the piece gets made. So The Traveling Bag, I should say, I come from, I grew up abroad. My father came to America on a boat. He's the child of Holocaust survivors. He was raised in the Soviet Union. They came to America with nothing. My mother's from Canada. My parents have moved around a lot. I had a very transient childhood. So obviously the suitcase for me is like, it's a very personal object. Like, I spent a lot of my childhood packing my house up and moving and going on trips and visiting places, and hearing stories from my grandfather about, leaving everything he had behind to flee the Nazis. And then being, locked up in a camp. And so certain things for me as an artist, like in my performance practice, that are very, very personal to my story and how I got here and why I'm sitting here today in front of you, to me, that's meaning that I feel very compelled to share. And it doesn't have to be overt. I don't need to talk about it in the performance. But of course, my hope as an artist is that some of those themes and some of those feelings are transmuted through the experience of watching the performance. I'm going to show you guys very little video today because, and it's something I struggle with because, documenting performance is very hard because I don't make performances that are made for a stage set. I make performances that are made for non-traditional spaces like a Renaissance church, or I've done a lot of performances in public spaces or performances that happen inside a gallery where maybe you're used to seeing things on a wall or on plinths. So when I first started performing, I would tell people, I don't make video of my performance because if you want to see it, you've got to make it there. I'm a little older and wiser now and realize documentation is everything. Photographs are not enough. But that being said, I'm not going to show you guys that much video today because one day, hopefully we can all perform together. If it weren't COVID, my dream was to come to ERIE and do a performance workshop, but that'll have to happen later. I was then invited to do, this is another example of an interesting hybrid opportunity where I was invited to do a stage set design at the Chelsea Hotel for a play that was written by Patti Smith and Sam Shepard. And then they, through me making the stage set, they said, well, would you like to open the show with your performance and set the stage? Because the stage set was supposed to be this mess. So I got to perform every night for a month at the show. And it was a great experience. Again, as an artist, you're always looking for ways to monetize your practice. And this was a great way to figure out, like, okay, I'm going to get paid to do all this set design. And let me just say, people don't ever want to pay you to do performance art. You're lucky if you get an honorarium. So I supplement my performance making. I used to supplement it by doing a lot of stage set, like I said, and I supplement it by selling paintings and objects. But this was a good opportunity. This was a good example of kind of doing both things. This is the most recent time I did this. I wanted to show this image because this is how pared down it can be. This was with a few performers. This was at a festival in California called the Bombay Beach Biennial. And I went to a Salvation Army. I got like 5 suitcases for $10. I went around to a bunch of the musicians. I asked them if I could take stuff from their spaces. I would return all of it. The musicians wanted to be a part of it. I got a megaphone at this, the performance is always, this performance, the traveling bag, it's always evolving. And yeah, that's my first baby, the traveling bag, and I'm still doing it. This was, I guess 2 years ago, but I'm still doing this piece. This is a little performance that came out of that, just to give you guys an idea. I believe in my practice of performance, like the performances are always lending themselves to another version or another story I want to tell. So I was invited to come to Poland. I was showing my work in an art fair in Warsaw. And the gallery paid for me to come and blah, blah, blah. But then the fair asked me would I perform. And I felt very mixed about it because like I talked about using my voice to you guys a little bit ago, Poland is a place, like all my grandparents came from Poland. All of them lost their citizenships when they left. Polish people murdered my ancestors. Hundreds of my ancestors were literally murdered in the soil in Poland. And I recently, right before this, had become a Polish citizen to be able to live in the EU. And I felt, I can't say I felt so psyched about going back to a place that I had so much ancestral baggage. I didn't feel so great about it. But I was honored to be asked, and I was like, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to do a version of this bag piece, but it's going to be called Dirty Laundry. And I'm going to have one suitcase and I'm going to make these images on cotton and I'm going to unpack them from the suitcase. And I'm going to talk about my dirty laundry, metaphorically. And I'm going to talk about the dirty laundry of Poles, of people in Poland who, were complicit, your ancestors were complicit in killing my ancestors. And that was a really big, that was a very interesting, very emotional thing to do. And it was a good thing for my practice, and I learned a lot, and it was very interesting to hear people's thoughts about it, and it was very cathartic. And I believe as an artist, you know, not everything you make has to be super profound, super personal. It can be funny, it can be lighthearted, it can be shitty, it can be whatever the F you want it to be. But sometimes opportunities come that in front of you that, you know, call you to really, I think, look into like the deepest part of your soul. And performance for me has been that opportunity to deal with things that that are difficult, and that are not like, that wouldn't look as good on a painting, you know, that kind of stuff. It's a little too heavy for painting, but it's good for performance. It's good for something that's ephemeral. Okay. Next performance I'm going to talk about is called The Day the Father Died, or The Death of the Father. And these two images are works that I did probably 5 or 6 years apart. The work on the left is Joseph Stalin, the great dictator of Russia, printed on a very, very tiny little piece of silk and painted into with some inks. The picture on the right is his family, Stalin's family, painted as printed on a huge piece of paper and painted with oil paint. And this was like I show these images because I kept coming back to Stalin. Like, my grandparents met in a gulag, and you know, my father and my aunt were like, have memories of childhood where they had the pictures of Stalin in the classroom when he was still alive. And thinking like, gosh, why is this person, this historical figure keep coming back to me? As you can tell, history is a big topic for me. It's something that I feel very inspired by. So I remembered this story that my grandfather told me about my grandmother, where when she was in the gulag, they were making, 1941, they were making the slave laborers making uniforms for the Russian army. And the women there, this is like far, far, far Siberia, so it's really cold, and there are no shoes. And the women's feet working there were all getting frostbite, and they were dying of frostbite, and then having to have their feet amputated and dying. It's horrible. So my grandmother, who was a real anarchist and really didn't give a what anybody thought, went to the head of the camp, and she said, if you're going to have us making shoes and outfits, why don't you give us some so we're not dying? And he said something to the effect of like, you know, oh, you Jewish whores are all the same. And she picked up the inkwell on his desk and she threw it at him, and he ducked, and it hit the portrait of Stalin behind him. Ink flew everywhere. And she thought like, that's it, I'm dead. But she didn't care. I mean, she had nothing to lose. She was dying anyways. And next thing she knew, all the women had shoes. So it was this story. I never met her, but it was this story that was imparted to me as when I was a really little kid, about basically like, speak out about what's right and don't let anybody give you shit. So I realized like, God, I'm making all this work about Stalin, and the story really meant something to me. So I decided to recreate Stalin's funeral and his death, and to embody him. I don't know why these ideas come into my head as artists. Sometimes that's part of the process, but I made this work. The first time I did it, it was first, like, other than the traveling bag, the first serious one I did. I was invited to a theater to do it. And I realized doing it alone, like, I need other performers. It was the first time I thought, like, I don't want to just be performing alone. I want to choreograph other people. So I was invited to do this installation and a performance in a gallery in New York. And if you can guess, I made these screen prints. I had this coffin made. I made these screen prints. I spent the performance reenacting the death and the funeral of Stalin, which was this huge, major event in 1950s Russia, and throwing an inkwell at all of these portraits of Stalin. And then just as a side note, now I try to think a lot about like, how can I monetize my performance? Because as you can tell, they're very production heavy. and it costs money to make things. So I ended up selling all these off. It's a good example of how you can try to make something to sell from a performance. But it was a very interesting performance. I had 5 dancers who were dressed up like Russian schoolgirls. We chose music to it. There were props that, there was a very prop heavy as well performance. That's my studio assistant on the right. We made outfits for all the people working in the gallery. It was like a full immersive thing. This is a little video. I collaborated with another video artist on making an installation for a little room that was in the gallery with some of her work. Performance to me is like an amazing place to collaborate with different people and to bring them into your practice, whatever that means to you, whatever you're interested in doing, use a performance as a structure because it's great. The gallery wanted me to fill as much as I could. So all the screen prints, all the prints, we masked all these walls with images of Stalin, images from his funeral. And it was another very strange performance. I mean, I like to say when I talk about performance, like I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just sort of doing it. And working with other bodies was amazing. And a lot of times, people that you bring into your performance will teach you more than you kind of ever thought about doing yourself in the performance. And this work was really also not only just about this personal story, but it was also about like the ways in which authoritarian leaders really if you Google, this is an interesting thing, but if you Google funerals of authoritarian dictators, there is without a doubt for every single one of them videos of young girls crying. And I became very interested in like, what is this kind of daddy complex? What is it about authoritarianism that makes the dictator, the leader, into like the ultimate daddy, and the people become infantilized. We all become children. We all become school children, so deeply needing this leader and this father figure. So this performance was a kind of rumination on that, and a rumination on schoolgirls and all the sort of different, like I'm talking about these different symbols that you could bring into things. Okay, last performance I'm going to talk about, because I'm running out of time, was the biggest production undertaking I ever did, which was called They Only Give You Power If You Give Them Death. And it was a performance about, well, I'll show you the next slide. So I started to make these, what I call mind maps for my performances. So I could really keep track of all the influences that I'm interested in bringing in, because, in a lot of my performances, there's so much background information. There's texts that I'm interested in, writers and ideas and sounds, music, images, objects. And so this was an example of I actually made these as prints and ended up selling them at the performance as well. So this was a performance that I made about really the silence of women historically, and about like the myth of women and animals, and kind of animals, the way we've domesticated animals, to be sort of mirrored in the way that we have, for thousands of years domesticated women. And it was a pretty crazy performance. I handmade these 14 headpieces and masks. The headpieces are all made of animal parts. So there's horsehair, beaver tails, porcupine quills, rattlesnakes, and the supports for these headpieces are from various religions, different headpieces worn by women. So from Catholicism, from evangelicalism, Judaism, Islam, all sorts of different headpieces. I think there's even a Mennonite headpiece in here. And then I made masks for everybody in the performance, all the audience members to wear, because I figured I'd love for the audience to be a part of this performance. So it was in the middle of the street in New York City on West 4th Street. It was anchored inside a gallery, and we got permitting to basically take over the street. We didn't shut down the cars or anything, but it was the first time I did a performance that was completely in the public realm. And so people were like walking through, people were honking, but so many people showed up. It was probably 200 people sitting on the street. And the performance, I had two musicians inside, amplified, someone playing the harmonium and someone playing the harp. And there was a violinist. It was a beautiful piece. I handmade with a friend of mine who's a costume designer, all of the costumes as well. This is a little behind the scenes picture of me and all my performers. I had never worked with so many people. It was a crash course in learning how to choreograph this many women, this many bodies. But it was a pretty big success. I mean, it was like I took the risk and it paid off. And it was a very like meaningful. Are any of these videos? Hang on, here you go. It was a silent performance. There was no talking except for the music. And some of my performers were serious dancers. Some of them had never danced before. Some of them were just like other painters, women I knew who were kind of down to be in my performance. You know, the musicians were obviously serious musicians. Oops, sorry. Well, I'm running out of time anyways. Some more photographs and video. You can kind of see half the crowd. It was a lot of people. And it was really something else to have everyone in the audience masked, because as you can see, it's not really a good angle, but you can see they're all wearing their masks from the back. You know, getting the audience to be invested as members of the performance is also something I'm interested in playing with. You know, like I said, that dynamic that exists between audience and performer. Oops, sorry. All right, I'm almost done, but it's a little bit more video. But this is an example of a performance that like cost a lot, took a lot out of me, and paid off. But to do it again, you know, to be honest, like I've been asked to do it again, and it's a tough sell because it requires 14 performers. So something to think about: pared down performance that you can just do alone anywhere you go, versus like a mega production performance and all the things that exist in between. I will say, I'm going to show you guys this. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but you know, in my efforts to document this, we set up cameras inside the gallery facing the street and tried to get a stranger kind of documentation that's not as kind of a traditional. So this is a nice example where like the video that came out of the documentation of this sort of is able to stand alone as its own piece, as its own relic of something that I did. Anyways, it's all online. That's it. That's my whole talk. I hope we have time for some questions. And thank you guys all for listening.
Yeah, that was it's really hard to get questions going because you bounce from one thing and then you go into another, and I'm thinking this and then I'm thinking that.
There's a lot. You can ask me anything you want. Doesn't have to have anything to do with the performance.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what you were thinking of. Remember a few years back when there was that whole thing where clowns were popping up? You know, it was like people were like scared. I think there were some school closings related to it. Like, I don't know, but it kind of reminded me of your masks, like putting people in masks, random people, a bunch of 100 people, you know, because the whole clown thing was a bunch of, you know, just hooligans. It was like, I mean, it wasn't connected. It wasn't in one place, but it was happening on a macro scale, similar to how you're putting it all in one place. So I was just curious your take on that relative to your work. Like, would
Well,
you consider
I
that art
mean,
work? I don't know.
I always like to say like there's performance everywhere. And it's true. And that's what's nice about performance art is that you can do whatever you want. Um, some people abuse that reality and they make really mediocre or really shitty performance art. And some people take it to the extreme and make really amazing performance art. But performance art doesn't have to, one of the reasons I love it is that like it doesn't have to be this like painting or like printmaking or like sculpture. Like it doesn't actually have to exist in this really institutionalized, canonized sense. Like performance art can be dressing up and freaking people out, dressing up like a clown. I mean, it's all about like the person in a public space. It's sometimes taking place in a public space, and what are the reactions? What boundaries are you transgressing? Are you dressing up in a way that makes people uncomfortable? Are you screaming? Are you saying things that make people uncomfortable? Are you doing things that make people feel uncanny? Are you bringing things into realms where they don't really belong? I mean, all those things. That's to me like what makes up performance art, and that's why it's this kind of wide open thing. And so, yeah, I think it's happening all the time. I mean, when you live even in a place like New York, I mean, the homeless people singing in the subway, like that's its own kind of performance art, right? Like urban life and even rural life, like performance really just means the presentation of self in the public realm. So we're all performing. I'm performing right now for you guys. We're all performing all the time. I think really, I believe only when you're really alone are you not in some ways kind of performing. And so performance art is an extension of that in the same way that like doodling when you're on a call with somebody is a version of like some kind of strange drawing practice, right? Like it's all folded into our everyday lives. And I guess, yeah, what I realized I wanted to do was like draw that out in a more specific way. But I love when people do scary shit, like dress up like clowns. I mean, why not? So, I mean, not that I don't find it scary. I do find it scary, but it's so interesting to see how we react as a group, as a society.
I just always think back to, and I'm awful with names of performance artists, but the guy who shot himself, and then later on he goes to teach in school, and one of his students shoots a gun on campus. And some would say that that was one-upping the previous, he kind of mastered the master in that one. Mm-hmm. But others would say that was ridiculous and no one should shoot a gun on campus. And I found out that it wasn't, I think it was a blank. There was no bullet, so it was just the sound. But I'm always curious where violence and shock value kind of cross the line, and at what point can you still consider it art, or is it always art? I mean, you can make that argument too. But I need to ask you some questions.
Okay.
That are in this chat.
Okay.
So let me see. What do you think was the scariest part about your first performance piece?
It's a great question. The scariest thing is to realize that you have everybody's attention, because when you are used to showing work in a gallery setting, people will look at your work and hopefully they'll spend enough time with it that they're giving it adequate attention. But they're talking to their friends and they're looking at their phone or they're having a drink. And when you are performing, people are not doing that. They're not talking to each other. They're not looking at their phone. I hope. I've called out people before for doing that in my performances, but that's all a part of the performance. That's all part of my persona as a performer. So the scariest thing was realizing like, oh, wow, like I have everyone's undivided attention, and like, what am I going to do? And it's very rare that you are able to really command that. And stepping into that power is one of the reasons why I personally believe all artists should experiment with performance, because it's very, very empowering, exciting thing to do as an artist, and to realize like, oh, there are all these different ways in which I am connecting to people, and by commanding, an audience's attention and connecting. And for me, I realized like, oh, I want to look everyone in the eye. And a lot of people don't like that. A lot of audience members are like, why are you looking at me? Stop making eye contact. But I realized like, oh, this is such a scary but exciting opportunity to connect with strangers and to be in this new social presence and social place. Yeah, so that's my answer to that question.
I think it did pretty good with that. I mean, I definitely agree. It's hard to get people out of their phone and to really be a part of something, and performance art is pretty phenomenal at that.
Yep.
Next question from Caitlin Kolick. What is the best and worst responses you have received from your work?
Oh God. Um, the
Maybe
best
just
responses, I would say the best responses is when I am not being explicit in my performance about something, and someone comes up to me or emails me or leaves me a comment after the fact, totally getting what I'm talking, totally getting like what's on my mind. And that to me is that's like such a magical moment, to realize that a total stranger is totally on board and on my plane. It's like feels like I'm doing telekinesis with them. Um, because it really is like the power of art. It doesn't just, I mean, that's obviously not limited to just performance. That's anytime you make work where somebody really gets what's going on in your work and gets what's going on within you, I think is the reason why we become artists. I mean, that's for me, like that's one of the reasons you want to make work is to have those shared experiences with people you don't know and people you know, of course. But to me, that's the best response. Of course, like I'm always happy when people are impacted by my work or feel or will email me 2 or 3 months later and be like, I'm still thinking about that thing you said in your performance, and I read this book, and I, like when you realize that like you've somehow folded yourself into somebody's awareness or their kind of their landscape with the way they're thinking things. That's obviously like that's to me always the goal. The worst response, I mean, the worst response is when somebody just doesn't care. The worst response is no response. The worst response. I've had loads of people be like, that's offensive. I mean, especially with my Stalin performance, a lot of people were very, very offended that they felt that I was glorifying a person who killed, tens of millions of people, which I was not doing. But that's part of the risk you take in any art you make, is that you're going to offend people, which I'm much happier to offend someone than to make someone feel indifferent. I'm heartbroken when I feel like someone's like, okay. Like, when the reaction is basically nothing, that's to me the worst response. Especially because the performance, unlike the studio work, involves so much more personal, spiritual, psychic, physical energy.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions coming in. You're killing it. Violet, Violet, I'll get to you in a sec. I just wanted to ask, from good old Lisa, you mentioned good, bad performance art. Very interested in how to evaluate performance art. Any guidelines?
It's a great question because it's really hard with good, bad performance art. I came up, I mean, I'm not that old, I'm only 32, but I came up in a generation of really women who were using social media, like right when Instagram started, to perform a kind of emotional nudity and literal nudity. So there were a lot of my peers in the, like around 2010, 2011, like right when Instagram happened, like 10 years ago, who were using social media to literally get naked and talk about their bodies and to cry and to talk and to kind of externalize their emotional lives on the internet in a way that now is kind of normal and already sort of tired. But 10 years ago was really crazy. And that's not what my work is, not involved in that at all. That kind of thing. But, it was interesting. I was involved in some performances really, really early on in my career where I was a performer with like being directed by another artist. Where like there was a lot of involving a lot of nudity and involving a lot of, like I said, this kind of like emotional undressing. And to me, I found it like kind of a cheap sell. Some of it was good, but some of it I was like, of course people are going to want to watch good looking young women get naked. Like is that good performance art? So it's a funny thing. Like I've thought a lot about what makes good performance art that's actually good, that's not just like fun to watch, because I think that that's a line. Um, for me, immersing myself in, because documentation of performance art's so hard, it's a funny thing. Like, it's hard to know about existing performances. And for me, doing a lot of research and trying to read books, and you'd be shocked how many really of the greatest artists of the last 100 years have engaged in some kind of performance practice. Whether it's the Dadaists, like we talked about, Tony, or the Situationists, or feminist artists from the 1970s. There's artists, there's so much there to read about. And I find that, understanding the history and the legacy of these types of performances, for me, creates a kind of boundary of like what has been done, what hasn't been done, what are the symbols, what are the objects that we're using. I guess that's not really answering the question. What is a good, bad performance art? I mean, I think people have this idea of performance art that it's like getting naked and screaming in your face. I mean, a lot of people who haven't seen a lot of performance art, like, they have a very primitive idea, like, oh God, performance art's like crazy artists doing something that's, like, I would say, sort of embarrassing or humiliating to themselves. That's not good performance art. The object to me of performance art is not to embarrass oneself. It's not to humiliate yourself or humiliate anyone else. It's to get the audience, certainly out of their comfort zone, I would say, but also to get them thinking, and that's, I guess, what I was talking about with like commanding presence and commanding attention. It's like you have the opportunity to get your audience in the moment, in that very moment, not in a piece in a gallery later on or in something you put online that you don't know what they're going to see. Like, you have this unbelievable opportunity to control your setting visually, audially, in all the senses. And what are you going to kind of make your audience think about in that moment? So I guess that's how I think about it.
I'm curious. So when you're using your masks in your performance art, is that in part because you're kind of trying to prevent the possibility of embarrassment on the end of the participant?
It's a really good question. Yes, for that piece. I mean, that piece was also like, I wanted people to think about classical Greek and Roman plays, and like, part of the thing was, none of the performance said anything, but it was supposed to kind of be like a Greek chorus. And so many, and what that piece was dealing with was like also the gender roles and women as villains, and how those roles have, are thousands of years old from the Greek and Roman tradition. So part of the masks was also to make the audience identify with that time period, but definitely, like, to prevent the audience. People loved it. Like, my mother gets so embarrassed every time she sees me perform. Not embarrassed for me, but she's so not a performer, and she's so like, can't believe that I'm going out and doing this. And she was like, I want a mask every time you perform. Like, it made me feel safe. It also made me really engage in your performance. And I always think about that. I mean, she's my mom and I love her because I have to. But I do think about, like, it wasn't actually my goal, Tony, but it was a side effect that I will definitely use in coming performances, because I think people, you don't want to make, like I said, like, you don't want to make people unnecessarily uncomfortable. For me, that's not the goal.
That's interesting. I mean, I haven't thought of performance art much, but I've always felt that some of the people in the movement were trying to do that. And I felt that, trying to make the audience embarrassed, or I feel like that opens up an air of vulnerability that could potentially, cause an interesting, deeper relationship between the viewer.
Yeah, it's a very fine balance, I think. You want to make people feel that there's something at stake with them as audience members. Like, no, you're not scrolling on your phone. You're not in a gallery where the artist doesn't give a shit that you're, talking to your friends and drinking your drink. Like, no, you're you're accountable. Actually, as an audience member, you are accountable in that moment to the artist. And there is a level of, there's something that's serious that comes along with that. When you're in the theater, or I'm sure everyone has been to a play or been to a musical performance, like, you don't want to be the asshole talking. Like that's rude, right? Like, so you automatically as an audience member, and this is what I find interesting, and what I'm interested as an artist in playing with that dynamic, like you automatically assume a certain set of rules, as an audience member, that you're like, okay, I'm not going to talk that much. Maybe I'm going to whisper, you negotiate that space. And so it is interesting as to make performance art, to think about that. Like, how do you want your audience to feel? And, where are you going to push them towards? And is there a goal? And I've seen some really fabulous performance art where like you're moving. Like I was in there was a piece in New York years ago where like you moved through a house and it was a whole group and the performer was taking you through space. There's physical movement, there's emotional movement, there's intellectual movement that the performer is pushing you and pulling you through. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, definitely there has to be a level of vulnerability, or not. I don't know. Different artists have different strengths with that. If your strength is not bearing your soul, that's okay too.
Can we ask questions from the Zoom? I'm here with my students and I have to go in a few minutes. I'm just curious, do you ever perform now on Zoom? And if so, what do you think of all the black rectangles and the fact that you don't see your audience?
I don't perform on Zoom. It's not out of the question. It's not something that I'm gravitating towards. I have made a lot of video work dealing with the black rectangles during COVID as a result of Zoom. That I guess is my reaction to not being able to perform in person. I haven't performed on Zoom. I've been to some Zoom performances, some better than others. I recently attended a performance of a magician, not like a performance artwork, but a performance of a magician. My neighbor's a magician. And he did the Zoom thing with like 70 people on the Zoom. And it was so strange. It was such a strange thing to watch a magic show through the Zoom that I actually was like, this is an artwork. I mean, this is like one of the best artworks I've seen in a long time. So I'm not the person who's going to do it, but I definitely think 100%, 1000% that there is some really, really good Zoom performance to be made. Definitely. And I actually think Zoom is the best place you could do a participatory performance, because people would be very happy to participate.
Well, they might be if they're not shy, but for a shy person, maybe that would be an opportunity to be a performance artist.
Yeah,
shy people
definitely
are introverts, and it seems like it takes an extroverted personality to be a performance artist. Whereas, who knows, maybe in the Zoom, they would feel comfortable.
Definitely. I mean, definitely. I could see a performance. Well, we'll do another one another time. It's for another webinar. But like you could do a performance that's just silent on Zoom where you're just writing things and holding them up and getting people to write things. There was an artist that I know who did it was just a workshop with some other artists, but they did a secret telling Zoom where everybody had to be on the Zoom and tell secrets. And it was kind of a performance work.
Did they turn their cameras on?
Yes, everyone's camera had to be on, and it was not recorded, and it was not really for public consumption. It was sort of an experiment, and it was something. Some people were laughing the whole time. Some people were extremely uncomfortable. I mean, Zoom is definitely a good place to explore if you are not ready to get up in front of somebody and perform. That is for sure.
I think it's a good idea. Well, thanks for your talk. I have to go back to my students now.
Nice to meet
some of
you.
them will come with me, so we'll see.
I just wanted to get one last question in from Violet. There you go. You can turn your mic on.
Well, I guess I thought of a few questions, but I'll narrow it down to one. Basically, do you think, what's the difference, say, between performance art and just performance?
Interesting. I mean, I guess I sort of think of them as the same, to be honest. I know a lot of people who use who are like dancers or musicians who maybe don't want to do a performance as a dancer or as a musician, and so they say I'm just doing performance. They don't see their work as performance art, but they also maybe don't want to say, oh, I'm doing a dance show. They say, come to my performance. I'm doing performance kind of as its own thing. That's, to me, the kind of only distinction. to me, it's like, for me, I've only experienced like a semantic difference outside of the US. So in Europe, they don't call it performance art, they just call it performance. And performance is like everything that is performed. In England, they call it like performing arts, which is everything that's performed. Like music or dance or opera or theater or God, I don't know, like Olympic I don't know, anything that involves performance. So I don't personally see a difference. I don't think there needs to be a difference. I think some people are more comfortable saying I'm doing performance and not performance art because, like I said, performance art has this like historical weight that people think as kind of like embarrassing or over the top. It's interesting you bring it up. I sometimes, like when I'm doing applications for grants and stuff, like I just say, depending on the organization, like I'll just say performance instead of performance art. But it's a good question. I don't know. Do you identify with, do you like one or the other if you were going to do it?
I do think performance art seems to have a little more of like heavy.
It's like a little like cringy.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
Feels a little heavy label to take on.
Yeah. Take on whatever label you want to take on. I mean, yeah. Sometimes I don't even call, yeah. I mean, I usually just say, God, I'm thinking about the invitations I send up. Sometimes, it used to be like in the 60s and 70s, they called it like happenings. They didn't even call them performances. They were like, oh, we're doing a happening. I'm trying to think of other people what they refer to it as. I've done performances that I've marketed as talks. And then people have come expecting it to be a talk and it's not a talk. Just purely because I'm trying to circumvent like that performance label. But it's it's one of those areas where you can really play around a lot with the semantics you use to describe what you're doing.
Okay.
I think that's going to bring us to a wrap, right? We got like about 30 seconds unless anyone wants to get any last second squeezes of questions in. Anyone?
I just want to say thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you guys all for being here. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions about performance or about whatever, feel free to email me. You could find my email. Gosh, I'll put it right here. Feel free to email me if you are interested in performing. If you ever want to come be in a performance, I'm always looking for people who want to experiment with being in performances. I learned a lot of my performance work from being in other people's performances. So it's great to meet you all. And I hope COVID doesn't take away more of your school year.
Fingers crossed.
And thank you guys all for your, for your wonderful attention. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
No, thank you for coming through on Zoom to talk to us. Just some last second duty calls. Art as a Messenger of Social Change with Paula Burley, Rhonda Matthews, and Devana Paisley. Check out www.brucegallery.info for more info. I just wanted to give a thanks to SGA, the Edinburgh Art Department, and the ERIE Arts and Culture Center for all being contributing factors in this and for this being a thing and all. And for that, I'm going to say good night.
Okay, good night, everybody. Have a great night.